it really began when I first went to work for a company called Gribaldo Jones and Associates in Mountain View. And I did that in November of '68. And shortly thereafter, they began to go through an organizational change wherein they set up a holding company called Earth Systems and created each then existing branch office into a separate corporation. And you may recognize the structure because, of course, it's the structure that we have today. And at the same time, they began a very aggressive expansion program. And the owner, or actually there were a variety of owners, but the CEO was Al Gribaldo, who was my mentor in this business. And among the things they did was to decide to open up a shop in San Diego. And what they did actually was to buy a small testing laboratory that was opened up by a guy named Paul Garver. And Garver was a person of relatively high ambition and relatively little talent. And he ended up making a commitment to hire a local geotechnical engineer because he was going to move his office from National City to San Diego. And the requirement for the city of San Diego was that if you had a testing laboratory, you had to have a registered engineer. And Paul was a lab technician, a supervising lab technician. So he was in a world of hurt. And Al found out about this and came in and offered to buy him out and to set up a geotechnical company along with the testing laboratory. And so that was in the spring, summer of 1971. And Al approached me and asked if I'd be interested in moving to San Diego and running this operation. And so I said yes. I'm not too sure why, but I did. And so I remember that I was sitting in my office one day and Al came in and said, "We need to have a name for your new company." And I said, "Well, okay, when you need it." He said, "In an hour." And I said, "Well, let me give it some thought." And interestingly enough, one of the newly named companies in Earth Systems was the old Oakland office. And the person who opened that office, ran that office, was Bill Wigginton. And Wigginton decided to name his company NGEO, because Bill was an engineering geologist and NGEO, engineering geology. So that was sort of the seed thought that I had in my mind. So 20 minutes later, I decided that GeoCon would be an appropriate name. And at that time, it stood for Geotechnical Consultants. So we had a name, and the incorporation went through in September of '71. And I began flying down to San Diego every month, every 2 weeks or so, as this new office was being set up in San Diego at 6645 Convoy Court. So I did that for a few months, and then I actually became an employee of GeoCon on January 1st of 1972. And then we moved the family down in February of '72. And at that time, in addition to Paul Garver, we had Val Pothier, who was the geotechnical engineer that Paul had hired. And I think maybe one lab technician and myself, absolutely no idea of what the local geotechnical community consisted of. Zero concept of geology. And this moron Paul Garver trying to do material testing. And so we began to try and hustle up this and hustle up that. And before too long, it got to a point where we needed to have a technician, as sort of a senior technician. And Paul, and by the way, Paul Garver had come from Southern California Testing Lab, which is now Southern California Soil and Testing. And he said, "You know, the guy you want is Herb Maines. Herb works for Southern Cal, and he'd be a good guy." Didn't know Herb, called him out of the blue, and talked back and forth with him, and made him an offer, and he initially didn't think that was the right thing to do. And so I made him another offer, somewhat higher, and he took that offer, and so Herb then came over to the over to GeoCon. And the thing that's interesting about that was the first time that I had an exchange with Don Shepherdson, and the local people here will know about Don. And Don lectured me long and hard about the evils of stealing employees, and I had to admit that that's what I had done, and I knew that that really wasn't the right thing to do. So I had a bit of a guilt trip. Although, interestingly enough, pretty much from that day forward, we, for all practical purposes, never did it again. And so I guess I took Don's message to heart. So anyhow, it's Herb and me. And sooner or later, Garber realized the futility of it all, and he resigned, and shortly thereafter, Val resigned. And the story gets very, very complicated at this point in time because there were some dual companies, and there were buying and selling back and forth. And the way that it ultimately turned out was the original testing laboratory, which was called Construction Laboratories, was purchased by the old Geosoils group. And so we swapped locations. And so for a few months, we were located out in Sorrento Valley, gone from 6645 Convoy Court. Hated that location right off the bat. And so then, after a few months, we relocated to 7006 Convoy Court, just down the road. And so Herb and I are there, and we're kind of stumbling along, and I'm doing the engineering work, he's doing the technician work. Sometimes we have a part-time secretary, sometimes we have a part-time technician. And that sort of brings us to 1974. And in 1974, Earth Systems, the parent company, got into a bind. There was one of the numerous land development recessions in '74, and they had a long-term line of credit with Wells Fargo Bank, and Wells Fargo Bank called the note, and that's sort of a poison pill to a firm when that happens. And of course they didn't have the $750,000 or whatever it was that the bank wanted. So they went hat in hand to the bank and said, you know, how do we take care of this? And they said, well, you got to lop off all these losing subsidiaries, because at the same time that we had started San Diego, they started several other locations. And among those subsidiaries that needed to be lopped off was GeoCon. And by that time, without the corporate overhead bite, you know, I might have been close to break even, not quite, but, you know, just sort of limping along. And there were a couple of other firms. By that time, Gary Anderson in Sacramento had an operation, Bill Winton's operation, several others. And so we went up and had a big meeting, and Al said, well, you know, you can either, you know, stay in San Diego or you can come up and run our San Francisco office. Well, by that time, we'd been in our home for a couple of years, and the kids were in school and Little League and all that jazz, and so we didn't really want to leave. So I said that I'd stay in San Diego and see if I couldn't find a way to buy the corporation from Earth Systems. And came home and told Nancy, and she said, that's the day I lost my job. And so I went out beating on doors and finally found a banker, a guy named Derek Ashton at California Canadian Bank, who agreed to put a second on my house and lend me a few bucks. And Herb borrowed some money from his family, and we bought the corporate assets of GeoCon for $5,000. And they kept all the accounts receivable. So we needed working capital, hence the reason for the second on our house and Herb's little bit of money. And we sort of started moving along from that point forward. I'm trying to remember chronologically when Kent Zender came into the picture. I think that he may have been an